What could be so secret in the investigation of the Idaho 4 case that the feds wouldn't even let Moscow Police Department or the lead investigator, Brett Payne, in on it? Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky, and today I want to talk a little bit about the Idaho 4 case. I want to talk about a video that I watched this morning on a channel called Kathy's Indie Zone, and I want to give Kathy a shout out because I do follow her content. It's very straightforward, to the point, and she works off of the documents. So go check out Kathy's Indie Zone. Now, she was talking about this Idaho State Police forensics report that was recently released where they had listed Bryan Kohberger as a suspect on December the 5th. Now, Idaho State Police then put out a press release, and they were trying to basically clear this up, and they said that it was basically a clerical error. You know, Kathy's Indie Zone described it as a glitch. They were using old software, and somehow Bryan Kohberger's name got inserted into that line on that report. So it sounds kind of shady to me, but okay. So maybe they had a computer glitch, and this is how this all happened. Because we know that in January of 2025, Brett Payne testified on the stand that the investigation into Bryan Kohberger did not begin until December 19th of 2022, almost 7 weeks after the crimes occurred. Now, when Brett Payne said this, it kind of left a lot of us scratching our heads because we knew what we had read in the Probable Cause Affidavit. And I want to talk a little bit about that today because, in my opinion, there's definitely some false information that was included by law enforcement in this PCA. And I know that a lot of people will say the PCA is not that important. It's not the trial, but it is a very important document. You know, the Probable Cause Affidavit is what allows law enforcement to go and take someone's freedom, take them into custody. It basically keeps law enforcement in check. You need the PCA to secure an arrest warrant, and that has to be signed off on by a judge. So imagine if law enforcement could just go kick someone's door down and yank them out of their house without any facts or evidence to back up the reason why they would be doing this. We would have pure chaos. And we know that it's not uncommon for law enforcement to violate people's rights. I mean, it happens all the time. There's lawsuits all over this country where people are suing departments across the nation for millions and millions of dollars because law enforcement has violated their rights. They're cops. They're not attorneys. So it happens. But this probable cause affidavit, in my opinion, in the Idaho 4 case, did contain some false information. And in my opinion, you know, that's a big deal. Because if law enforcement is just making up information in order to go and arrest someone, then that kind of defeats the entire purpose of having the probable cause affidavit. So I want to talk about a few of the details that were included in the PCA that I believe are false information. And in my opinion, I believe that law enforcement included this in the PCA knowing that this information was not factual. So it's a big deal. And we're definitely going to get back to the video by Kathy's Indie Zone talking about Bryan Kohberger being listed as a suspect on December 5th. But I want to mention these two, details about the PCA that I've always kind of had a problem with. because now that new information has come out and we've had the opportunity to see the interviews by Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, now we have a pretty good indication that false information was included in this probable cause affidavit. A lot of it centers around the whereabouts of Ethan and Xana on the night and the early morning hours of the Idaho 4 crimes, because we know that law enforcement was still inquiring about the whereabouts of Ethan and Xana weeks after the investigation began. Investigators had no idea where Ethan and Xana were between 9 p.m. and 1:45 a.m. Now, when the probable cause affidavit came out, it stated that because of statements that Bethany made to law enforcement, that Ethan and Xana were at the Sigma Chi house from 9 p.m. until 1:45 a.m. But that's not what Bethany told them. Bethany told law enforcement that she saw Ethan and Xana for the last time at midnight because she had gone into a room at the Sigma Chi house to grab a backpack because she was leaving to go to another party with a friend. And that's when she saw Ethan and Xana sitting on the couch listening to music. This was at midnight. And then Bethany made it very clear that she had no idea what time Ethan and Xana returned home to the King Roadhouse. So how does Bethany's statement that the last time that she saw Ethan and Xana at the Sigma Chi house was at midnight turn into that she knew that they were there until 1:45 a.m.? Did law enforcement just make that up? Is that something they just fabricated to compensate for not knowing where Ethan and Xana were until 1:45? Now, a little later on in the PCA, it also says that because of statements made by Dylan and Bethany, that all of the roommates were inside the King Roadhouse by 2 a.m. But how would they know that if they didn't know what time Ethan and Xana got home? Bethany and Dylan were very clear when they said that they had no idea what time Ethan and Xana had gotten home. They didn't even know if they were in Xana's bedroom. So how would law enforcement know that Ethan and Xana were home with the rest of the roommates at the King Roadhouse by 2 a.m.? Or did they just make that up? We've heard a number of different times that Ethan and Xana supposedly returned home to the King Roadhouse. We've heard 1:45. We've heard 2 a.m. We've heard 2:15. But nobody really knows because the only two people who were left alive inside the King Roadhouse have no idea what time Ethan and Xana returned home. So to me, this is information in the PCA that is simply not true. I mean, if Dylan and Bethany didn't say this to law enforcement, then why would they say that Dylan and Bethany told them this? It makes me wonder if Dylan and Bethany knew that investigators were maybe stretching the truth a little bit, or maybe even making up information for the PCA. And that's why Bethany didn't want to come back to Idaho, because maybe she knew that some of her statements were taken out of context, or that they used her name to fabricate information for the probable cause affidavit. But either way, we know that there's definitely some discrepancies there. Now, did law enforcement know that they were putting false information in the PCA? I believe that they did, but obviously we don't know that. Now, let's get back to the video that I watched this morning on Kathy's Indie Zone, because like I said, she was talking about Brian Koberger being listed as a suspect on December 5th. And basically, Idaho State Police came out and said that this was a mistake. This was a clerical error, it was a computer glitch that was caused from using old software. So they basically kind of had an excuse of why Bryan Kohberger's name was listed as a suspect. And, maybe it was a glitch. Maybe it wasn't. But it does seem kind of dodgy to me. So it seems as though the Idaho State Police has tried to correct this information, because obviously this would not jive with Brett Payne's testimony in January of 2025, because he's saying that he had no idea who Bryan Kohberger was until December 19th, right before they arrested him. And he's the lead investigator working for the lead agency, Moscow PD, who supposedly is running this investigation, which I don't believe that. But anyway, so Brett Payne testified that he had no idea who Bryan Kohberger was until December 19th. So let's say that this really was a computer glitch and that it was just an honest mistake. It was a clerical error. Now, when are they going to correct the information about November 29th that was included in the probable cause affidavit? Because it states very, very clearly in the PCA that Brett Payne signed, sealed, and delivered that law enforcement began investigating Bryan Kohberger on November the 29th. So it wasn't even December 5th. It's been reported by news agencies and media outlets that law enforcement began investigating Bryan Kohberger just weeks after the crimes.
We did learn a lot of new information from a probable cause affidavit that was unsealed just about an hour before that appearance this morning. It was 18 pages long. It was super detailed. It gave the most information that we have ever seen in this court case. And what it showed is that investigators have been watching Bryan Kohberger since very early on in the investigation, about 2 weeks after the murders on November 13th.
Why would, these media outlets be reporting that if that's not the information that they're getting? And it was the information that they were getting, because it very clearly states in the probable cause affidavit that on November the 29th, only a few weeks after the crimes occurred, that 2 Washington State University police officers, not only one, 2 of them, and it says that they were working independent of each other, located this white Hyundai Elantra that law enforcement is looking for. Not only do they locate this white Hyundai Elantra, but they also identify the owner as Bryan Kohberger. Now, after they identify Bryan Kohberger, they enter him into the WSU database, and they look at his photograph, and they both agree that he matches the description given to Moscow Police Department by Dylan Mortensen. He matches the description of the individual that law enforcement is looking for in connection with the Idaho 4 crimes. This is not speculation. This is all information that was given to us by law enforcement. These Washington State University police officers located this car and identified Bryan Kohberger. Now, they also began an investigation, and we're going to get into that. But before we do, I just wanted to say that I really don't believe that these 2 Washington State University police officers were just looking for some random white Hyundai Elantra. I believe that they were looking for Bryan Kohberger's car. I believe that they were asked by agencies higher up to locate a car owned by Bryan Kohberger. I don't believe that they just plucked this white Hyundai Elantra that was the wrong year that they were looking for right out of the city of Pullman, Washington. I just don't believe that. So after Washington State University police locate Bryan Kohberger's car at his apartment and identify him, run him through the Washington State University database, and determine that he is a student at Washington State University and then look at his photo and both come to the conclusion that he matches the description of the individual that Moscow Police Department is looking for, this is when I believe that they pass the baton to another agency, a higher agency. And this agency continues the investigation that began on November the 29th by Washington State University Police, because I don't believe that Washington State University Police would be conducting a more thorough investigation. I believe that they would pass this information up to the higher powers and they would take over this investigation. Now, the PCA goes on to state that investigators do a DMV search on Brian Kohberger's license plate. And that's when they discover that he's been pulled over 2 times since he moved to Pullman, Washington in the middle of the year. So one of these times is in August, and he was pulled over for going 8 miles an hour over the speed limit and not wearing a seatbelt. He was pulled over by the sheriff's department, and through body cam footage from these 2 traffic stops, investigators discover that when Brian Kohberger was pulled over in August, he gave this deputy his cell phone number. So now we have investigators looking through body cam footage. They're researching Brian Kohberger in the DMV database. They're researching Brian Kohberger in the WSU database. So this sounds a lot like an investigation to me. I mean, they're investigating Brian Kohberger from November the 29th. Now, they, discover that Brian Kohberger gave this deputy his cell phone number. And they take that cell phone number and they do a query on it. And they realize that this number is serviced by AT&T. So the PCA goes on to read that upon further investigation, they run a query on this telephone number that's serviced by AT&T, and they determine that Brian Kohberger's phone number was not in the area of the King Road house between 3 and 5 a.m., or at least his phone was not on during that time. So all of this is going on, and Brett Payne, the lead investigator, knows nothing about it. They've told us that all of these agencies were getting together daily to do briefings, sometimes twice a day, so they could share their information about their investigations. So all of this is going on. They're obviously focused on Brian Kohberger, and Brett Payne knows nothing about it, according to him. Now, I think that this is when they begin following Brian Kohberger. I believe that they began watching him, and I'll tell you why. Now, further down in the PCA, it states that investigators believe that Brian Kohberger is still driving this car on December the 13th because his license plate is picked up by a plate reader in Loma, Colorado. Now, why would they just believe that Brian Kohberger was still driving this car on December 13th when his plate is picked up by a plate reader in Loma, Colorado, if they weren't following him and watching him in real time? If they weren't, watching him drive across the country? Because obviously when they arrested him, the car was in the garage. So obviously he was driving the car. I mean, they didn't write this probable cause affidavit until the end of December. The arrest warrant wasn't issued until December 29th, and he was arrested on December 30th. So obviously when they wrote this probable cause affidavit, they did know that he drove this car to Pennsylvania to his parents' house. So to me, when they say we believe that he was still driving this car on December 13th because we saw him on a plate reader, That leads me to believe that they were watching him in real time. I mean, that's the only thing that would really make sense. We also know that Brian Koberger and his dad were pulled over twice in Indiana on December the 15th. They were pulled over by two different agencies within 10 minutes of each other, and they were pulled over for tailgating. Now, I've driven all over this country. I've road tripped all over this country, and I can honestly say that I have never in my life been pulled over for following the car in front of me too close. So, law enforcement will swear that this had nothing to do with this investigation. It was just a coincidence. But I don't believe that. In my opinion, I think that they were following Brian Koberger across country and they maybe lost him and they were gathering him back up. Now, it makes no sense to me why they wouldn't just tell us that. Why wouldn't they just say that they were watching Brian Koberger as he drove across country? I mean, media outlets were reporting that this is exactly what happened in this investigation. So why were they reporting that? I don't believe that they were just making that up. I think that they were getting this information from somewhere. And I do believe that investigators were watching Brian Koberger as he made this road trip. Something else that I've always thought was kind of strange about Washington State University police locating Brian Koberger's car, identifying him, and then determining that he did match the description of the individual who they were looking for, is that they never brought him in to question him. Why didn't investigators bring Brian Koberger in and ask him some questions? They questioned everybody else. Why not Brian Koberger? Now, in my opinion, I do believe that they began watching Brian Koberger after they located his car. And really, in my opinion, the only reason that they would just sit back and watch him is if they believed that he may lead them to something, maybe someone or maybe somewhere. It seems like that would be the only reason why they would want to sit back and watch Brian Koberger, is to see what he was going to do next, or, see if he was going to lead them to something. But it just always seems strange to me that they never brought him in to question him, because a lot of people have said, well, maybe they didn't want to tip him off, but they had already put out the be on the lookout to the public for a white Hyundai Elantra in the beginning of December. So it didn't appear that they were worried that they were going to tip him off, that they were onto him. So on December 19th, Brett Payne says that the feds called in a tip to Moscow Police Department. And this is the very first time that Brett Payne has heard the name Brian Koberger. So the feds call in a tip on Brian Koberger after they've done this entire investigation. And then they call Brett Payne and tell him, you might want to look into this guy. And then Brett Payne starts a completely new investigation into Brian Koberger. I mean, why would they do that? The feds have already done all of the work. They've already done the investigation. So why would Brett Payne restart an entirely new investigation? I mean, that makes no sense at all. But, I just don't understand why law enforcement would not just tell us, that they began investigating Brian Koberger on November the 29th. Ashley Jennings from the prosecution, in a really recent interview, said the same thing. She reiterated that they did not know Brian Koberger's name prior to December 19th.
Yes, when we heard the name on December 19th, at that point, that's really all we had was a name. And it was a new name. It was a name I'd never heard before. No one on our team had ever heard before.
So why wouldn't the prosecution and investigators want us to know that they began investigating Brian Koberger 2 weeks after the crimes occurred? It just seems weird that they would try to hide this information. I mean, either, the feds never let Brett Payne, the lead investigator, in on the idea that they were doing this investigation this whole time, or, Brett Payne is lying. It's one or the other. I mean, how did they conduct this entire investigation without ever, letting the lead investigator in on it? I mean, that sounds kind of ridiculous. And in my opinion, this is the reason that many of us question this investigation, because we've read the probable cause affidavit. We know what is in the PCA, and then we know what we've been told, and the two don't match. I mean, why wouldn't the feds want Moscow PD to know this information? I mean, in my opinion, I don't really believe that Moscow PD was involved in this investigation at all. I think they put up the crime scene tape, maybe conducted a few interviews, and that was it. You know what I mean? I think that the feds handled the majority of this investigation with help from the Idaho State Police. But what I don't understand is why they would keep Moscow PD out of the loop. I mean, they didn't even give Moscow PD all of the information that they were gathering during their investigation. They wouldn't even give the information to the prosecution when the hearings began. I mean, Bill Thompson stood up there and was like, we're not getting this information. In my opinion, Moscow Police Department was the face of this investigation, and that was the extent of it. We remember in the hearings, Bill Thompson saying that they were having problems getting information from the feds. So the feds didn't even want to share this information with the prosecution. So what was so secretive? What was so top secret that the feds couldn't even share this information with the lead investigator, the lead investigating agency, and the prosecution? It must have been pretty top secret to not want to share the information with anyone in Moscow, Idaho. I mean, I just think that's strange. And it actually worked out pretty good for the prosecution, because being that they had very limited information, as well as, Moscow PD, they could only release what they had. So was that the plan all along? That they would just feed Moscow PD and Brett Payne the information that they wanted to, and then, that would be all that they would be able to reveal to the defense. And they would keep all of the big aspects of the investigation, quiet and hidden with the feds. In my opinion, it just seems as though there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. And that would, lead us to believe that there's something much bigger behind all of this. That, a quadruple homicide is big enough, but I'm talking about the investigation. It seems like there was a lot more involved in this investigation than, we'll ever know. And does that mean that there was more to this crime than we'll ever know? Who knows? Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I hope that y'all had an amazing day. We'll see you next time.